Greetings, Agape class. This is Neil Donovan. Today, I'm going to try something that I've done several times through the years as your associate pastor, and that is to give you a quick, not too long, sort of crash course on the entire Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament. So it's a big book, as you know. The Old Testament is quite a bit larger than the New Testament, but it's comprised of 66 books written over the course of several thousand years. The Old Testament is the true genius of the Jewish people and is really one of the unique and treasured books of antiquity and literature, as well as being, of course, our sacred texts. So I'm just going to go through the general flow of the Old and New Testaments and then make some comments at the very end. So, of course, in Genesis, we have the creation stories, but we also have in the beginning the call of Abraham to become really the first Jew, and then the development of his family and all the interesting things that happen with his children and his grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Until finally, in the last chapters of Genesis, we get one of the really great jewels of the entire Bible is the story of Joseph and his brothers, and how Joseph goes to Egypt, and through the providence of God, he is used by God to save the Jewish people from really starvation and ruin, from a famine, by becoming one of the top and most powerful men in Pharaoh's power source. Then we go so that story ends with that story of Joseph, and then in Exodus we have a story of another Jew named Moses, and the story of God helping the people come out of Egypt, where they are under rough times and enslaved by Pharaoh. And we know all about the plagues and the crossing of the Red Sea. And then we get into a long, long story about the wanderings in the wilderness through what we now call the Sinai Peninsula. And that takes up a lot of the book of Exodus, as well as Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Included in that are not only the stories of them making their way across the desert and all of the different things that happened there, all of the struggles and trials and joys, but also many of the early Jewish laws and codes about what to wear, what not to wear, what to eat, what not to eat, and many different liturgical rituals. Some of those people don't find very interesting, and a lot of them are in all those books. But all of those books also have stories in them. And at the end of Deuteronomy, we have the great story of Moses looking out over the bluff into the promised land, and he dies there, taking his people to where they needed to go. And then we go into Joshua and Judges, and those are really the books about the early days of them settling themselves into the promised land, which of course had lots of other tribal groups already living there. And so they had to make their way and sometimes do battle and push people out and so forth. But those stories are also very interesting. The book of Ruth is a little bit of an outlier and a favorite book, but I don't really have time to discuss it. And then we have another block of history, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And those are basically the stories of the rise of the Jewish people from a tribal confederacy to having a king with a palace and a temple and all of those things. The great rise of King David, the uniting of the northern and the southern kingdoms, to the height of its power with Solomon, David's son, becoming one of the great kings of the Near East. And then we have some books, Ezra and Nehemiah, which get into really some other things that happened to the Jewish people after they were settled, where they were attacked first by the Assyrians in the 700s BC, and then by the Babylonians in the 500s BC. And in particular, with the Babylonians, they were carried into captivity into what we now call modern-day Iraq, where they were exiles. And these books of Ezra and Nehemiah are about the people finally coming home and rebuilding Jerusalem and rebuilding the temple. Of course, I'm skipping lots of details, but this is the nature of this talk. And then we have the book of Job, which is another it's called wisdom literature. It's a different kind of book altogether, dealing with the issue of God's presence in our lives and suffering, and it's another one of those great and important books. Psalms and Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, those are all books also in the category of wisdom literature. They're used for edification. The Psalms were used for music, for singing, for lyrics or words to be put to music. Ecclesiastes is a very strange little book that has quite a bit of, I guess you'd call it skepticism in it, about, just a skeptical attitude on life. And Song of Solomon is really an unusual book because it appears to be a sort of a love poem between a bride and a groom during their wedding. And it's really not clear why it was put in the Bible in the first place. The rest of the Old Testament, and this of course is very sweeping, but it is all prophets. Basically, you would say prophecy is not really so much predicting the future as speaking on behalf of God. So Isaiah will say, "Thus says the Lord," or Jeremiah says, "Thus says the Lord." So these people are bringing the truth to the people. God is speaking through them. These books are often difficult to read at large blocks of time. Isaiah is probably considered the greatest book of the book of prophets and could have possibly been written by as many as 3 different authors. And then, so you have the major prophets. Isaiah and Jeremiah would be the biggest 2, or the most famous 2, considered the greatest literary, the greatest theology, the greatest spirituality. And then the minor prophets doesn't always necessarily mean that they weren't as good. It sometimes just means that they were shorter books and were perhaps not as revered. Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And then we have the shift to the New Testament. The New Testament is primarily comprised of 3 different sets of texts. There are the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which have the stories of Jesus. And then we have letters, primarily of Paul, but also of Peter, James, the book of Hebrews, whose author is unknown, and John and Jude. And then the third category is the Revelation, or the book of Revelations, or sometimes it's called the Apocalypse, which is a dreamlike book full of code language and mystical teachings, and is very difficult sometimes to understand. But I'll say a little bit more about that later. So the Gospels, of course, these books are not necessarily written in chronological order. The same is true of the Old Testament. They're not necessarily in chronological order. I don't have time to delineate all of that, about which books are out of order chronologically and so forth. But I can tell you this, that the first texts to be written in the New Testament would have been the letters of Paul. So Paul wrote his letters before the Gospels were written or published, okay? It is widely considered that Mark's gospel was the first to be written, Matthew's perhaps the second, Luke's the third, and then John is the last. John's gospel is the most different. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are sometimes called the synoptic gospels because there's a synopsis or a coming together of many stories, all three together. John was written as possibly as many as 70 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus, whereas Mark's gospel may have been written only 20 years, maybe 30 years after the time of Jesus. The letters, though, would have come much sooner after the passing of Jesus, particularly the letters of Paul. Paul is probably other than the Gospels, which tell us everything we know and need to know about the life of Jesus, the death and resurrection, all of his teachings, all of his parables, and so forth. Paul's writings are probably the next most important of the New Testament, and it is Paul who really it is believed, and I certainly believe, is the one who really brought the church together. If Paul hadn't believed that Jesus was the promised Jewish Messiah that had always been promised, and he had become the incarnate God, meaning God in the flesh, God living among us, walking among us, teaching among us, telling us clearly who God is and how we are to live. If Paul had not had that revelation, maybe somebody else would, and somebody else would have stepped up. But Paul was really the one who made it happen. He had such passion, and he was willing to travel. He was willing to suffer. He was willing to be persecuted, imprisoned, stoned, all kinds of shipwrecked. Everything imaginable happened to that guy. He was a brilliant theologian. He wrote one of the first great, what we might call theological tracts of the Bible, the book of Romans. He really was the one who is responsible for Protestantism, really by teaching that salvation is a gift and not something you earned, and many, many other great teachings about the presence of Christ in our lives and how we understand the sacrament of the Lord's Supper and so forth. But just remember that Paul did not have access to the Gospels. He was not able to know a lot of detail about the life of Jesus or what Jesus taught. He didn't know any of the parables. He didn't know the story of the feeding of the 5,000. He only knew something very personal and what other people like Peter who were there told him about what they had seen and heard, and as well as his own revelation that he experienced on the road to Damascus. So all of those letters of Paul are extremely, extremely important to the life of the church and to our own spirituality. Revelation was written during a time of great persecution and was written to give hope to Christians who were under great persecution during Roman oppression. And so it was a way to use code language to say, we think that God is going to win in the end, and all will be well. So let's go back again and try to summarize the big flow. So we have creation, the story of the actual creation of the earth and the entire universe. We have the story of the formation of the Jewish people from the very beginning with Abraham and Jacob and Isaac and all of the early ones. So we have all of those very early stories, and then we have the story of Joseph in Egypt, and then we have the story of the people of the Israelites or the Jews having to live in Israel, and then God calling them out and, so to speak, really helping them come back to where they started by having to leave there because there was famine. They had to live in Egypt because they would have starved to death had they stayed in Palestine. But then God brings them back to Palestine, which is now a fertile, wonderful place, a land flowing with milk and honey. And then we have all the stories of how they found themselves there, they established themselves there, and then the rise of the kings. We have the stories in Samuel about the warnings about, do you really want a king or not? Maybe we should keep things simple. And the people kept saying, we want to be like other nations. We want to have a king. We want to have a palace. We want to have a temple. And Samuel would say, but just remember, kings will tax you. They will take your boys away from you and make them into soldiers, and so forth. And then, of course, skipping some things, we have the rise of the prophets. We have the stories of the Assyrian and Babylonian captivities and conquests, but a huge part of the Old Testament really are prophecies of, thus says the Lord, this is what you should do. Know justice, walk humbly, love mercy, take care of the poor, treat people fairly, don't cheat. Don't forget all of the rules and regulations that I've given you. And that's really a big chunk of the Old Testament. And then we have in the New Testament the stories of Jesus, the letters of Paul, the letters of some of the other writers, the formation of the church. I forgot to mention earlier the book of Acts, which is the story of the early church, which was also written by Luke. And then, of course, we have the Revelation, which was written, like the book of Daniel in the Old Testament, under great persecution. I think my last comment I'll make with this kind of sweeping story is that a lot of times I've been asked, well, how did the Bible how did these 66 books get chosen? And some of you may know, if you have other study Bibles, or if you grew up Roman Catholic or in the Orthodox Church, they have other books that do not include. And gosh, it's a complicated thing. I've done several classes on this. There were councils that took place where decisions were made during the Reformation with Martin Luther and John Calvin and so forth. There were also decisions that had to be made about books that were in and books that were out. But that it's I don't know if you really want to know all the details about all of that, but it is interesting to know that I will say this, let me just keep it pretty simple. Some of the books that are in what are called the Deuterocanonicals, or sometimes it's called the Apocrypha. I don't really like that word because it sounds like they're not true or something. Deuterocanonical means really between the two canons. Like, I wish there was even a better word we had for like the books that were written between the Old and New Testament. Some of them really are just as good as some of the other books in the Old Testament. I mean, there's another book called Ecclesiasticus that's really just as interesting. There's a book of wisdom that is for some reason not included in our 66 books, but it's every bit as good as our book of Proverbs. So if you have one of these Bibles that has the Deuterocanonical, the text between the Old and New Testament, try them out. There's also the book of Tobit, the book of Esther, which is a really interesting book. The book of Judith is real interesting. Some of them are just great stories. But if you like things like the Proverbs, the wisdom of Solomon is really, really good. I really do believe it's every bit as good as the book of Proverbs. And like I said, I'm not really sure. First and Second Maccabees, I'm just kind of looking through these. There's a lot of them. Some of them are, to my mind, just as interesting historical accounts as what we might get in the books of Samuel's or Kings. as far as just enticing people to read the Bible, especially people who haven't ever really read big chunks of the Bible, I've got a few suggestions, and I think I'll just finish up with that. So here's the deal. If you only read a few verses here and there, and if you have, say, like a spiritual devotion book, and it'll give you maybe 3 verses from the Gospels and some verses from the letters and maybe some verses from one of the Psalms, you're never really going to understand the whole flow of the Bible from the Jewish people, their formation, their rise, to the time of Jesus, where really they were kind of at a low point, and then this belief that took off into the world of Jesus being God in the flesh, and the development of the church and all of that. If you don't read some of these texts in big chunks, you're really not going to really ever understand the way it's all put together. And also, you're just not going to, I just don't think you're going to ever really understand it correctly. But don't start with something like the book of Leviticus, and don't try to read through the entire Bible in 6 months or something. I think that kind of bogs people down. If you can do it, great. My first suggestion is, there are so many translations now in English, so many. Check them out, go to a bookstore, go online, come to the church library, read all the different ones, see one that you like. Don't worry about which one's the most scholarly. If it reads well, go for it. If it suits you, the way it's written, go for it. And for the Old Testament, I would say, try the book of Genesis. Really, the entire book of Genesis, even though it's fairly long. It's about 50 chapters. I don't know how many pages that is. But really, I will say this, the whole book of Genesis is really interesting. And you can read it in a couple of days, and you will not be disappointed. The other books that I think are the most interesting for reading, like for people who like to read novels or like to read short stories, would be 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. Those books are great. And there's lots of really, really interesting stories in there. And they can be read in big chunks where you can read maybe 10, 15 pages at a time. It's not exactly what you'd call a page turner, but these are stories that you will find very, very interesting. And you will want to keep reading them. Like I said, the prophets are tough because it's really like reading Homer's Iliad or something like that. It's Milton's Paradise Lost. It's poetry mostly, and you do have to read a little bit slower. Some people like this version by Eugene Peterson, who's now deceased, but was a Presbyterian minister, called The Message. It's kind of written it's not really a translation. It's a sort of interpretive narrative, but many people are fond of it, and it kind of gets them hooked on reading the Bible. All the Gospels are really interesting. They're easy to read. The letters of Paul can be difficult. Romans is pretty difficult, but some of the others aren't. But I would start with the Gospels. And particularly, I would say start with Mark if you're not a Bible reader, because Mark is the shortest. It's the most ancient, the first one. It kind of cuts to the chase. It's got all the basic stories, and it's just the best one to start with. And then I would go to either Matthew or Luke, and John last. John has got more poetic, philosophical language in it. It's a little more difficult. But don't be intimidated by it. Take it in pieces. The other thing that I think can awaken people's interest in the Bible is watching some kind of something on YouTube, like a video series or some of those great courses things that you see advertised in the Wall Street Journal. on the New Testament or the Old Testament, or if you got DVDs, we've got things like that in the church library. Nancy could help you find some of these things, and they'll take you through the Old Testament or through the New Testament and explain a lot of things to you. Because I know a lot of people just aren't readers. Some people also like to listen to the Bible. I think we probably have in our church library the entire Bible on CD, where if you could stick it in your car, or maybe there's something you could get more high tech that you could just listen to, download it somehow on Spotify or who knows what, and just listen to it as you're out walking, something like that. That can also sort of get you interested or re-interested in the Bible. So I hope that helps, and let me know what you got out of it, or what helped and what didn't. All right? It's always good to be with you all, the Agape class. Take care.